Milk crates like this have a million uses, and they also make really handy storage boxes. Unfortunately, you can't really obtain them legally, and they're also kind of ugly. So I set out to make some storage boxes inspired by milk crates of my own. So this box, being slightly larger than the milk crate, is similarly sturdy, but it looks much nicer and obtained legally. In this video, I'm going to go through all the steps that I went through for making some boxes like this. I just recently finished building my homemade slot mortising machine, so I used lots of mortise and tenon joints in making these boxes. And so this video is another opportunity to see some of my jigs and machines in action. So enjoy the video.
I start by cutting some recycled IKEA shelving into strips, which I'm going to use for the frames for the top and bottom of the box. Next I use my table saw sled to cut the strips to length. I'm cutting 2 at a time. To join the corners, I use a very fine box joint, or actually more like a finger joint. I'm using my homemade Screw Advanced box joint jig to cut these very fine joints. Each turn of the crank gives me exactly the right spacing to cut a finger joint, with the width of the blade being the width of the cut. And here's my cut joints as came out of the jig. The slats are joined to the rails with mortise and tenon joints. This gives me lots of opportunities to use my homemade slot mortising machine. To make the shape for the handles, I start by drilling 2 large holes on either side of the handle hole. To cut the space between the round holes, I use once again my slot mortising machine to make a straight cut between the 2 round holes. Next I use a 1/4 round bit to round out the edges of the handles. Before gluing the top and bottom frames together, I do just one more test fit just to make sure everything fits nicely. I made a wooden comb with the same finger spacing as my joints to help me get the glue into the joints. I have to check that it's square right away because the joints actually end up tightening up pretty quickly. Next I rub some sawdust onto the excess glue. That way I can scrape off the excess glue with the sawdust without smearing it all over the place. To put the last piece in, I have to actually glue up both joints at the same time. It's always a little bit tricky to get it in because there's not very much time to get it in before the glue really sets. Next I cut the slats. One 2x4 is thick enough to cut 3 of these slats out of it. I'm ripping them on the table saw. I run them all through the thickness planer just to make sure they're all smooth and of consistent thickness. Next I use my table saw sled to cut the slats to length. I can cut 3 of those at a time. Next I use my homemade tenon jig to cut the tenons on the ends of the slats. The tenon jig allows me to cut both cheeks of the tenon with just one clamping in the jig. Next I round the edges of the slats just using a 1/4 round bit on the router. Next I cut the shoulders of the tenons. I only need to take off a tiny amount, so I'm just pushing it across the saw blade sideways. Next I round the edges of the tenon with the carving knife. There's a lot of edges to cut, so I'm going through this pretty quickly. Next I glue all the slats into the bottom frame. To glue it together with the top frame is more difficult because I have to actually apply glue to every single one of my joints before mating them together. This is where it gets tricky because I have to get all the slats to fit into their respective holes. They don't all align perfectly, so it's all a matter of pushing them in the right spot and then banging them in. Next I apply some clamps to it just to make sure everything is really pressed together. For the corners of the box, I make some L-shaped profiles on the table saw, which I then glue into the corners. Here's one of my L-shaped profiles, which I'm just about to glue into the corner of the box. To glue the bottom onto the boxes, I cut a rabbet along the bottom inside edge. I'm using my slot mortise machine as a router table to do this. For the bottom of the boxes, I just use plywood. The plywood I'm using here is actually recycled from an old desk, so part of it is stained. Because I didn't cut my rabbets all the way into the corner, I need to trim the corners off of my plywood bottom. I put some glue into the rabbet on the bottom of the box and spread it around with a rubber spatula before I put the bottom in. Although I glued the bottom onto the boxes, just for good measure, I'm also attaching it with some screws. Next I use my table saw to flush trim all of my box joint edges. I then use a quarter round router bit to round the corners of the box nicely. I use the same router bit to round the outside top and bottom edges of the box. Finally, I'm trimming the box up a little with the head plate, especially the inside edges because I didn't route those. And the boxes are all done. I hope you enjoyed this video.